Thank you all for coming. My name is Yuri and I'm an educational manager at Genius Premium Tuition. Today, Dean and Brad will be talking to you about the SATs. I want to let you know that this talk has some practical exercises in it, and we are going to take a 30-second break right now to give you time to grab a pen, a calculator, and something to write on. I hope you managed to get everything you might need. You should also know that a recording of this meeting, as well as a detailed meeting notes, will be provided at the end of the session. So please listen instead of spending the whole webinar taking notes. There will also be a Q&A session at the end of the talk. Now I would like to introduce Dean to you. Dean has been at Genius Premium Tuition for 7 years. Dean matriculated with 5 A's at school, and then he went on to study applied mathematics and computer science. After tutoring more than 1,600 hours of mathematics and science at Genius Premium Tuition, he decided to move into education full-time and now supports me, the other education managers, all our tutors as the managing director. Now, Brad matriculated with 3 A pluses and 4 A's. Brad finished high school at 17 and went on a Rotary exchange program to Taiwan. When he returned, he started agricultural science degree at UCT before being accepted at and then attending Harvard University, where he completed a BA Social Studies. As a tutor at Genius, Brad is not only able to provide students with varied methods of teaching he has picked up over the years, but also he encourages them to study overseas and answers any questions they may have about getting a degree in the USA. Over to Brad now.
Thanks, Yuri. Good evening, everyone. As Yuri said, I'm a tutor here at Genius. And yeah, when I finished high school, when I was in Taiwan, which was 11 years ago now, I had to write the SAT because I was keen on applying to universities in the US. But because I was in Taiwan, it was a little bit of a struggle. The SAT's content is pretty different to what I was used to coming from the IEB system in South Africa, and even as it was 10 years ago. And so I had to learn it all on my own and approach it myself, trying to find out where I could write it and what days it was being held. And that was a pretty daunting, scary experience. And it was tough to take on my own in a foreign country. And I had no idea what to learn. I had to kind of put that together on my own. And that brings us to this talk tonight, where we're going to be running through an overview of the SAT and focusing on who we are, as you've heard already, what the SAT is, what a GPA is, who needs to write the SAT, what the SAT covers and the format of the test itself, SAT maths compared to IEB maths, when and where you can write it, how you can prepare for the SAT, and then what exactly Genius Premium Tuition does and how we can help you. So to get us started, over to you, Dean.
Thanks, Brad. So we've been supporting students in South Africa since 1993. In that time, we've taught over 2,800 students, helping them to get into universities in the US and all over the world by providing SAT preparation and guidance courses. The SAT is to American universities what the NBT is to South African universities. It's a standardized mathematical and literacy reasoning test that is added to your profile when applying to a university in the States. So the SAT doesn't stand for anything. It used to stand for Scholastic Assessment Test. It is now just referred to really as the SAT. You might also have heard SAT 1 or SAT Reasoning Test. These are all the same thing and just refer to the SAT. There was also an SAT essay. This was an optional 50-minute essay that was offered as an add-on to the SAT. It's no longer an option as of this month, actually, June 2021. You also may have heard about the SAT 2s or SAT subject tests. So these were separate assessments that were required / recommended for specific degrees at specific universities all over the world. They included tests like literature, US history, molecular biology, Japanese, many subjects. So these are also no longer an option as of June 2021. And so when we refer to the SATs, and when you think about the SATs, the only important test is this general reasoning English and maths test that we're going to run through now. Why do universities use the SAT? As you can imagine, there is a huge variety of curricula, subjects, and assessment standards across the world. This poses an interesting problem for admissions departments in the US and other countries. How do they measure everyone in an objective and comparable manner so as to evaluate candidates fairly? So the SAT is used for a similar purpose to our South African NBTs, as I mentioned earlier. It's a convenient way for universities to rank and process applicants. So on the next slide, who needs to take the SAT? There are many reasons why a South African student would take the SAT. The most common and relevant to you guys in the IEB curriculum are because you are studying in America and are applying to universities that either require or recommend that you write one. Not all universities require or recommend that you take one. And so that's something that you need to pay attention to in the application process. B, you might also be trying to get a sports scholarship through a program like the NCAA. And then C, many universities in the UK, Europe, Asia, all over the world really also require or accept SAT scores. They really do transfer to universities all over the world, although they are most widely used in the United States. And then finally, if you are applying to become an SAT tutor at Genius, you need to write the SAT. You also need to score exceptionally well. Right. I think it's important to know that the SAT isn't the only important metric when applying to the States. You also need to know a little about the GPA, and I'm just going to talk a bit about that. So the GPA is a grade point average. It's a lot like the South African APS system that universities use. Every curriculum around the world effectively has a reference table like the one you're seeing now that is used to convert your high school results to the currency of GPA. Unlike the APS, your results from the last 4 years of high school are converted to a GPA score, which is taken as a summary of your academic achievement in high school. Why the last 4 years? In America, high school, unlike in South Africa, where it's 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, high school in America is 9, 10, 11, and 12. Unfortunately, there is no one GPA calculation. Different institutions and even different universities slightly vary in their calculation rules. And so the method for working out your GPA really depends on what you're working it out for. So for example, if you are going through the NCAA on a sports scholarship program, it will be a different thing to how a university might directly work out your GPA. And you can see that here, if you get a B, that's anything between 70 and 79%. That could equate to a GPA of 3, same as a C, or a 3.3 or a 3.5 in some cases. So we actually have a detailed breakdown of how to work out your GPA on our website under blog if you're interested. Because the talk is on the SAT and not on the GPA specifically, we've decided not to go into too much detail. This table is very rough and the calculation methods for weighted GPAs require a bit more info. You're welcome to ask questions about it in the Q&A or, like I said, to check out that article online. Okay, so I will answer one common question about the GPA, which is, can I get a GPA higher than 4.0? So yes, technically. It's common for universities in the States to give an extra, it's called a quality point for AP or IB classes. This means that the GPA can be as high as 5. But when I say AP, I'm referring to advanced placement college level classes run by the College Board. These can be taken while in high school and regularly are taken while in high school in the States. And they're not to be confused with advanced program as an AP Maths English that you might be doing at your IEB school. So those AP courses, AP Maths, AP English that you're doing at an IEB school are still only worth 4 points. So that means if you're coming from an IEB school and you aren't taking any additional AP subjects, advanced placement that is, IB or sometimes full A-level courses, then you can't get a GPA higher than 4 and it's not relevant to you. So that begs the question, how can you compete for acceptance at universities whose average GPA is above 4? So you can see here, for example, even if you're a straight A student, in other words, you get from grade 9 to matric, you have A's for everything, even A pluses for everything, you would only end up with a 4.0 GPA, whereas the average candidate who gets accepted into the University of, let's say, California, Los Angeles, has a GPA of 4.29, whereas Stanford 4.18, Columbia 4.12. So the question is, how can you compete? There are many ways to make yourself a more attractive candidate for a prestigious university, but the simplest way to improve your academic resume is to get an impressive score on the SAT. So the SAT, what does it cover? It's divided into two main sections: English, which is evidence-based reading and writing, and math. Each of those sections is then further broken down into two subsections. So overall, we have 4 SAT subtests: Section 1, reading; Section 2, writing; Section 3, no calculator; and Section 4, calculator. So I'm going to hand over to Brad, who's going to run us through a little more depth on each of the sections.
Thanks, Dean. All right, so as Dean said, there's 2 sections in the English part of the SAT, and the first of those is the reading section. And this is basically a comprehension section. So what this consists of is 5 separate comprehensions, 4 with single passages, and then 1 that has a pair of passages that you are asked to compare and draw similarities between. Each of those comprehensions has 10 to 12 multiple choice questions based on it. So you end up with a mark out of 52 at the end of the reading section. Okay, so 1 or more of the passages in this section might be accompanied by a graphic, like a chart or a bar graph or a scatter plot or something like that. And the questions around that will then ask you to interpret the data shown in that graph that relate to the passage, right? The passages fall generally into one of 3 categories. The first category is the US and world literature, and that's usually 1 of the passages. And then there's history or social studies, and that's 2 of the passages, either 2 of the single passages or 1 of the single passages and the pair of passages. And the last section is science, and that also is 2 of the passages, either 2 single passages and then 1 of the single passages and 1 of the pair of passages. Each of those passages, each of the comprehensions will have around 500 to 750 words for you to read, okay? Now, it's important to note that these passages and the question frameworks are very different and also much more difficult than the kinds of comprehensions that you are used to in the IEB or CAPS systems in South Africa. And that is very important to note because it's really important to practice the SAT type of questions specifically. So, typically, you get 75 seconds to read and solve every single SAT reading question on average. So we're going to give you 75 seconds to read and solve this sample question.
This is a 20-second warning.
And time. Right, we even removed one of the answers. Usually there are 4 options. We even removed one of them to make it easier for you. So do you guys get it? The answer is B. So conventional is being used as an insult here. It's insulting the attitudes and the structures that surround contemporary treatment of the arts in public life. So there's an example of a reading question for you. The next section in the English section is the writing section. Now this test consists of 4 passages, and each of them has 11 multiple choice questions. Okay, so in total, you're treated to 4 passages and 44 questions in the writing section. And the passages fall into one of these 4 categories, either careers, which is where they discuss trends or debates in major professional fields like medicine, technology, or business. There's social studies, where they draw from history or anthropology, psychology, sociology, those type of fields. There's the humanities, where an author explores trends in literature or the arts, including all the normal ones, prose, poetry, art, music, dance, that type of stuff. And then finally, there's science, which focuses on topics in earth science, biology, chemistry, or physics. Now, each of these passages has 400 to 450 words for you to read. And all of the passages will be argument-based or non-fiction or explanatory. Okay? At least one passage will be accompanied by a graphic, as we mentioned in the reading section, a chart, a table, or a graph. Now, the writing and language section tests your editorial skills, your skills of language. So these passages are riddled with errors in structure, punctuation, word choice, organization, grammar, whatever you want to call it, testing how well you can edit the passage. It's important to note that the expectation of command of language rules and editorial skills is far more substantial than what is included in the IEB or CAPS curriculum. And what's more, the rules are tested in standard American English. So that's obviously in contrast to in South Africa, where your IEB or CAPS syllabus is in the standard British English framework. Okay. So typically, you get 48 seconds to read and solve every SAT writing question. Okay, so we're going to give you 48 seconds to read and solve a sample question. The question is, you are going to be given a paragraph, and each sentence is numbered. There's 6 sentences. Your job is to determine where the best position for sentence 2 is, either where it is now or after sentence 3, 4, or 5. 48 seconds. Ten seconds. And time is up. All right, did you get it? The correct answer is after sentence 5, because sentence 2 mentions the high price of the playwright's tickets, which logically follows sentence 5's description of how the price of tickets was determined. And then sentence 2's claim that the price reflected the real cost of the performance also logically comes before sentence 6, which discusses the non-altruistic nature of the donations. All right. Now, once we're done with the English section, you move on to the math section, and that also has 2 subsections within it, non-calculator and calculator. And the first is the non-calculator section. Now, this has 20 questions. The first 15 are multiple choice, 4 choices each. And then the last 5 are grid-ins. So you get bubbles of numbers, and you have to work out the answer on your own and bubble in whatever number you've calculated. So you've got about 75 seconds to read, interpret, calculate, and answer each question. The no calculator test basically only tests questions from the areas that we've called the heart of algebra, passport to advanced maths, and additional topics in maths. We've done a technical analysis of 20 SAT actual past papers, and of the 15 subsections that are covered in the non-calculator section, more than 70% of the questions fall into the following 5. So in the heart of algebra, there are linear equations, interpreting and graphing linear functions, and system of equations. And in passport to advanced maths, there's quadratic equations and interpreting nonlinear functions. That's most of the questions in the non-calculator section. But remember, the non-calculator section only counts for 1/3 of your total score in the maths section. Now, what kind of maths are you expected to be able to do in your head? So this section actually doesn't ask you to do particularly difficult, complex calculations by hand and in your head. It's actually much more about reasoning and problem solving. There's still some arithmetic maths-based questions, basic adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. And it checks that you understand like fundamental maths and fundamental maths concepts. And you don't only rely on a calculator to get to your answer every time. So typically, as I said, you get 75 seconds to read and solve every question in this section. So we're going to give you 75 seconds to do a test question here. You're going to be given an equation and you have to solve for the variable. Remember, you're only allowed to use mental maths and scrap paper, no calculators. 75 seconds. Twenty-second warning. And time. All right, the answer there was A. 8, the numerator in the fraction can be rewritten as 2 to the 3, which gives you 2 to the 3x, and then you end up, when you work it out, with 2 to the power of 12, which is 212. All right, the next and final section is the maths calculator section. This section consists of 38 questions. So the first 30 are multiple choice with 4 choices for each answer. And the last 8 are grid-ins, like in the section before, where you have to work it out and fill in your own answer. Okay. The calculator test contains questions from the Heart of Algebra section, Passport to Advanced Maths, additional topics in maths, and also problem solving and data analysis. So from that same technical analysis of the 20 past SATs that we've done, it's become clear that of all of the 22 subsections that we've identified that are covered in the calculator section, there's about 70% of the questions fall into the following 9 subcategories. So from Heart of Algebra, again, it's linear equations, interpreting and graphing linear functions, and systems of equations. From problem solving and data analysis, it's rates, ratios, and proportions, percentages, unit conversions, and tables and probability. And then from Passport to Advanced Maths, it's quadratic equations, and then exponents, radicals, polynomials, and rational expressions. Now, the calculator section counts for 2/3 of your total math score, obviously, as the other section. So typically, you get 87 seconds to read and solve every SAT calculator math section question. So we're going to give you 87 seconds to read and solve this sample question. You're going to be given an equation, and you have to solve for a ratio of variables. So remember, you're allowed to use a calculator in this one. 87 seconds. Twenty seconds left. And time. Right, did you get it? For this question, the answer is B. I'm not going to go into how to solve it. If you want an explanation, you can email us for the answer explanation and we'll happily give it to you. For now, over to Dean.
Thanks, Brad. Cool. So we want to talk now about how the SAT math compares to the IEB mathematics. So here's a table comparing how important, by mark weighting in matric finals, each of these sections are in the IEB syllabus, and how important, again, by mark weighting in the exam, they are in the SAT. So note, this is a rough estimate. The SAT and IEB category weightings vary from sitting to sitting, and many SAT subsections could fall into one category or another. So specifically, some of the questions we could have assigned to algebra, or that we have assigned to algebra, equations and inequalities, they could have been assigned to patterns, sequences, or growth. But you can see here that there's a huge misalignment between the two exams. The SAT places an overwhelming emphasis on algebra, equations, inequalities, functions, and graphs. So those sections make up more than 70% of the test, whereas the topics in the IEB exam only account for about 20% of the syllabus. So in what grade will you have covered all of the content necessary for the SAT, so to write the SAT? Once you've finished the algebra, equations, inequalities, functions, and graphs in grade 11 in an IEB or CAPS school, you're just about good to go. In grade 12, there are very few concepts taught in these categories that will help you with the SAT questions. So just to speak specifically about AP maths, as you could see from the table above, the AP math concepts only account for about 6% of the SAT. But the vast majority of that 6% are questions in two sections only: complex numbers and absolute values. Those are not big topics as pertain to the SAT, and the necessary content is relatively easy to learn. So because I said that you're not going to learn anything in grade 12 that will help you with the SAT that you haven't already learned in grade 11, you might get the impression that the SAT is easy, and we didn't mean to give you that impression. So basically, although you have learned many of the necessary fundamental skills, the expectation placed on students writing the SAT to synthesize, evaluate, and apply their knowledge is very different from that in the IEB. So in addition to this, you're competing on an international level in an international arena with millions of students who have put the time in to learn not only the content, but how to play the game of the SATs. So that means applying and using advanced exam, time management, and multiple choice examination techniques. Okay, now I want to speak a little bit about the SAT scoring. How does SAT scoring work? So unlike IEB exams, the SAT score is not a direct result of what percentage of questions you get right or wrong. So firstly, the basics. Each of the English and mathematics sections in the SAT is scored on a scale of 200 to 800, meaning you obtain a total score on a scale of 400 to 1600. They just add them up. And by the way, that's 1600, not 1600 if you're speaking SAT. The scores go up in increments of 10. So 1080, for example, is a possible score, whereas 1085 is not a possible SAT score. There's no negative marking in the SAT, which means you can't lose marks for writing in the incorrect answer. So it's not a bad strategy to guess at answers that you aren't sure on. So how is the score calculated? The number of marks obtained in each subtest is calculated and then looked up on a conversion chart, and hence your score is obtained. Okay, so for example, in math, if you get 0, so 0 marks, that would convert to a math score of 200. Whereas 58 marks in the math section, there are 58 questions, would convert to 800. So 57 marks often also converts to 800, depending on the sitting. And so it is possible to get a perfect SAT math score without actually getting all the questions right. And that's because of the conversion table that I spoke about. You need to know that each conversion chart is unique to the specific SAT sitting. So you can't use one SAT's chart to grade another SAT. So for more details on how to mark SAT, again, that blog on the website that we have, which runs through the SAT for IEB students, has a document that you can use, and it's very comprehensive. So why is the SAT scoring so messy? Why isn't it just simple? The scoring works like this, so that after every test, the College Board can grade to a curve. Raw scores, that's the number of correct answers, are mapped to SAT scores in such a way so that no matter how difficult or easy a particular SAT sitting was, a 640 on one SAT, even if it's an easy one, means the same thing as a 640 on another SAT. So for example, in an easy test, if you get 39 math questions out of the possible 58, that might equate to a 660, whereas on a harder test, 34 questions right could also yield a 660. And so basically the scoring charts are curve adjusted. The next thing you need to know about is super scoring. This is very important. Many universities will accept a super score of your official SAT scores. What that means, for example, so if in May of 2020, let's say, you scored an 1100, and let's say that that is 600 for the maths and then 500 for the English. And then you write again in March the next year, 2021. Again, you score 1100, but this time you get 500 for maths and 600 for English. So far, your best English score has been 600 and your best math score has been 600, even in 2 separate sittings. Many universities, the ones that do super scoring, will consider you to have a score of 1200 in the SATs, 600 from this one and 600 from this one. You can find a list of all of the, not all, but you can find a list of many of the universities that offer super scoring on our website. Okay, so then guessing. So like we saw earlier, if you just write your name and don't fill in the bubbles, you'll get an SAT score of 400. But what if you just fill out all A, or you don't know anything about maths and English and you just have a go? So I want to talk about that a little bit because it's useful to get a sense of the scale of the scores. If you literally just fill it in randomly, there is an 80% chance that you will get a score anywhere between 680 and 860. If you're very lucky, let's say 10th percentile lucky, you'll get 860 plus. If you're very unlucky, you'll get 680 and then lower. So in other words, the range of possible and interesting scores really starts at 860 and goes from there up to 1600. More on that later. Let's talk about going in blind. So what I mean by this is you are an IEB student, you're doing well at school, maybe you're not doing so well at school, whatever it is, and without doing any preparation for the SAT specifically, you register and go and write an SAT. That's what I mean by going in blind. Over the last 28 years, we've assessed literally hundreds of SAT students, and part of our assessment process includes having them write an SAT as a baseline. So this means that we have hundreds of data points of students' performance in the SATs, and what I'm going to talk about next are some insights that we've gleaned from the data set. So if we go over to the next slide, just to speak a little about mathematical literacy, if you're taking mathematical literacy according to the data we had, it doesn't matter if you're in grade 11 or grade 12, and it also didn't seem to make a difference if students were getting 40% or 95%. All of our Maths Lit students who wrote the SAT for the first time scored between 400 and 460 on the SAT math test. And that was before any SAT specific preparation. That was before a course or online work, that kind of thing. To speak about Math Core now in a little more detail. So although students at the end of grade 12 tended to perform on average 20 points better than students at the end of grade 11, it was the end of grade 11, the grade and term barely correlated with the SAT math score. So it didn't really seem to make a difference. And for you math buffs out there, if you calculate R squared, which has to do with correlation coefficients, it ended up at 2%. So basically zero correlation. It doesn't make a difference according to the data, whether when you're going in blind, whether you are in grade 11 or 12. So the math mark to SAT math mark. So this is now not talking about what grade you're in, but what actual scores you're getting at school for IEB maths, showed a very strong correlation. This was an R squared of 51%, again, if you're interested. So without SAT specific preparation and on their first write, this is how our students typically scored. Again, all this data is available, so feel free not to take notes. So students who are getting like E's and F's in Math Core typically scored around 450. D students typically scored around 540. C students and B students didn't seem to make a difference, typically scored around 580. A students, that's anything below 90 and above 80, typically scored around 610. And then A plus students typically scored around 650. whereas the maximum, as you know, is 800. Right, that's maths, English. So we are not going to speak about first additional language because that is not a subject that any of you watching this talk are taking. But with the home language English, as with the maths, students at the end of grade 12 tended to perform 20 points better, but there was a very low correlation. R-squared of 3%, if you're interested, it didn't seem to make a difference. And that's kind of further evidence that you should start writing towards the end of grade 11, and we're going to talk about those logistics later. So what was the result, right? So this is now talking about how a student performs typically in home language English at their IEB school and how they're likely to perform going in blind to an SAT. So based on our data set, E and D students typically scored around 410 in the English. C students typically scored around 490. B students typically scored around 560. A students, 610, and then A plus students around 630, even lower than the maths. It's very difficult to get an exceptional SAT English score without specific SAT English preparation. Over to the next slide. Cool. So in total, this gives you an idea of the range of expected SAT scores based on your IEB grade 11 or 12, doesn't matter, average result for both Math Core and English home language. This doesn't count if you are taking Maths Lit. This is what you can expect to get going in blind to an SAT without any kind of preparation. Okay, again, this will be available. No need to write this down. Cool, next slide. So what is a good score for the SAT? So first you just need to understand what percentile is. It's a much better way of thinking about scores than percentage. So for example, like if you have a learner who scores a 2 out of 10 on a math test, that's 20%. It sounds bad, right? But what if the learner was in grade 7 and it's an MIT Advanced Math Challenge test, right? Maybe the 2 out of 10 wasn't so bad after all. Can you see how percentage on its own is not useful as a metric of how well a student performs in a test? Instead, you can ask the question, all of the student's peers that wrote the same test that he did, how many of them scored worse than him? So maybe a 0 or a 1 instead of a 2, and how many scored better? So a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 instead of a 2. And then you can say, well, what percentage of students scored worse than him? So in this case, the student who is in grade 7 and he's writing an MIT test, it's very likely that 98% of kids will get 0 or 1 on this test. So this student is at the 98th percentile, which has nothing to do with the 20% he got. Okay, so if you understand percentile, then it's very useful to look at this table and see what the equivalencies are in terms of percentile for your scores. So this doesn't say, for example, that your 80% in school, you should aim to get around a 1250. No, what this says is if you want to be in the 80th percentile, 1250 is the score you want to go for. All right, so now what score do you need? Okay, instead of a university's minimum accepted SAT score, so there is no SAT pass score, it's useful to think about the SAT score you need to get being an average SAT score that a student who's actually been accepted at that university actually got. So for example, if you do the search online, 75% of students accepted at UCLA got an English score of 670 or higher, and 25%, so the top 25%, got a score of 760 or higher. For the maths, 75% of students accepted at UCLA got 690 or higher, and 25 got 790 or higher. So that gives you an idea, if you're applying to UCLA, of the range of SAT scores that you want to be landing in. So, and it also depends on your GPA. So if your GPA is particularly low compared to those other students that applied, you want your SAT to be particularly high and vice versa. So in this case, we would take the halfway mark, and you might want to aim, for example, for a score of 700 plus for English and a score of 730 for maths in the UCLA example. You can find most universities' SAT requirements with a quick Google search. So if you type in now UCLA SAT requirement, it'll come up. Cool. Over to the next slide. Where and when can I write the SAT? So in the United States, students are typically start preparing for the SATs and are prepared by their schools in grade 9, and then the preparation continues. Basically, what we recommend in South Africa, because of the way the IEB curriculum works and because of the way our exams work, that you should start practicing for your exams in around grade 10, and you basically want to write towards the end of grade 11, preferably get it out the way mid-grade 11, end of grade 11, and that gives you a couple of opportunities to write at the beginning of grade 12 if you need to. So these are all of the things that you're balancing, right? So on the one hand, you don't want to interfere with your matric finals or even really your grade 11 finals or prelims. You don't want to waste time learning SAT content before you've gotten to it in school. But on the other hand, you do want to write multiple times to take advantage of super scoring. And you do want good scores relatively early on in order to apply to universities. So again, with all of that in mind, we recommend you start preparing for your SATs in grade 10, depending on what score you want to get. And then you should aim to write your first SAT in the middle of grade 11, and ideally your final one towards the end of grade 11. If you don't get the score you want, then you do have 1 or 2 write opportunities in matric, although you can write late into matric. It depends on what intake year you're going for. Right, how many SATs can you write? So I alluded to writing many. No university will penalize you for writing multiple times. In fact, the average university student in the US has taken the SAT something like 2.4. It's somewhere between 2 and 3 times. The College Board and the universities literally encourage you to take it multiple times in order to get the best score possible for you. All right, so in South Africa, it varies from year to year, but it's common for the SATs to be hosted on the first weekend of each of the following months. So these are regular write slots. Again, this is all available. Let's go to the next slide. Where can you write the SAT? Okay, so you can find a comprehensive list of available test centers on the College Board's website. We're going to just give you an overview of some of the test centers, the more popular test centers in the South Africa area. So these are them. Perhaps more relevant for this talk are the 3 in Gauteng. This is by no means a comprehensive list. Again, I just want to stress that. And so you can find more centers available on the College Board's website. Okay, registering for the SATs. So you can register for the SATs up to a month in advance of the test. And in some cases, even later, up to 2 weeks in advance, depending on whether or not late registration is available. The SAT costs 1,000 Rand to 1,500 Rand, depending on what options you choose, and also the exchange rate, of course. All right, I'm going to now hand over to Brad, who's going to talk a little bit about how one can prepare for the SATs.
Right, thanks, Dean. So basically, as an idea, we're going to chat a little bit about some tips for preparation if you're interested in studying for the SAT. So there are obviously different types of practice and preparation in general. And we like to talk about preparation for the SAT as falling along these scales here. So there's long-term or short-term practice, content or technique-based practice, absorbing or applying practice, and then there's exam emulation or relaxed practice. And we'll go through each of those now. So the long-term versus short-term, if you're writing the SAT in less than 5 months' time, then all the practice you do is going to be short-term, wherever it falls on the other dimensions, as we'll get into in a little bit. But long-term is, several months or years in advance preparing for it. And this is specifically applicable to the English section. So if you make it a habit to read SAT reading level content daily or weekly over a long period of time, starting so years in advance, there's definite statistical proof that can improve your SAT English score on the whole. So if you're in grade 9 or 10 and you want a really competitive SAT score, you should start engaging in long-term practice as opposed to just short-term if you cram in just before the test. The next is content versus technique. So a student who knows and understands all of the content, 100% of the content of the test, can still be outperformed by another student who knows less but has better SAT test-taking techniques. So the content practice is about learning the rules, the structures, the concepts in maths and English, becoming a better reader, a better editor, better at doing sums. But technique is about employing strategies to get a better score, given the length and the format of the test, which is mostly multiple choice. So you should aim to get in most of your content practice before delving into the higher level exam technique practice. Unless you're doing it all last minute and you're writing soon, then you need to balance that out as you go. Then there's absorbing versus applying. So applying is obviously a crucial step in the learning process. So practicing questions and solving problems is a great way to figure out what your blind spots are and find out if you actually know something as well as you think you do. So applying includes doing practice questions, working through problems, writing practice exams, that type of stuff. The absorbing is a different way to learn, and it's often overlooked. And that's all about reading content, watching videos, explaining concepts to yourself or to others, and mapping out your knowledge. So not actually doing questions that test it, but actually trying to make sure that you understand it by absorbing it. And if you balance applying with enough absorbing, then you'll perform much better in the SAT. And then finally, there's exam emulation versus relaxed. So relaxed practice is any practice where there is not an appropriately, so where you're not timing yourself in how long you complete the task. And it is a crucial step, and it's where most of your learning happens. So this is working through past papers, doing practice examples, watching videos, studying the books, whatever you want to do. But then there's exam emulation. And that's something that most students will avoid, but actually has a huge impact on the learning process and on your ability to score well in the test itself. And exam emulation is the specific, I'll call it an act of working through an actual past paper, so something that's been tested before, under exam conditions, so closed book and timed, and preferably in an unfamiliar and somewhat uncomfortable, we'll say, environment. And then getting feedback from the test in the form of a test diagnostic. So where they actually mark your test and tell you what you got wrong, and so where you went wrong. So you should really aim to include exam emulation in your learning process. It's a really great opportunity to actually figure out what you got wrong and learn and solidify both your content and your technique taking. All right. So what do you study? The SAT has 10 official practice tests. It just sort of fluctuates with time, but at the moment they have 10, and they're actually past papers or drawn from past papers. So they're designed to be no different in terms of difficulty than an actual SAT, an official SAT that you would write. Okay. So of the 10 currently, tests 2 and 4 were removed from the official suite because they don't quite match the standard and the content anymore. So there's really currently only 8, but you can find a ton of other past papers as well. All right. These 10 official tests or 8 official tests are a fantastic opportunity to test yourself on. So you shouldn't use them for relaxed stuff. Ideally, you should use them for exam emulation, okay, where you actually write it as a test. Now, where do you find all of these, the best resources? So there's a ton of available materials for the SAT. Textbooks, videos, practice questions, and tools online, all over the place, right? So students and tutors who've come through our program have sampled many of these tools and resources over the years. And based on their feedback, and in conjunction with our own SAT training program, we recommend that if you want to go online, you go to Khan Academy, which is obviously the free academy. They have a ton of SAT support, or Prep Scholar. If you're looking for textbooks, we recommend Kaplan's SAT Prep book. They release a new one basically every year, or Barron's SAT Prep books. Those are also really good. And obviously, if you want one-on-one tuition, Genius can provide that for you with our qualified SAT tutors. And over to Dean.
Cool. So yeah, look, grade 10, is a really good time to start thinking about all of this. If you plan on getting a high SAT score, you should plan out your study schedule and exam dates well in advance. You need to get an SAT score to match the degree and institution that you're aiming for. So a lot of research is warranted in this space. That's where we come in. So we have a sophisticated SAT diagnostic that splits the SAT into 37 discrete subsections and identifies the content and technique, strengths and weaknesses of students. That's useful because we cross-reference not only what you know and don't know, but we cross-reference that with what sections are particularly big in the SATs and what are not. It's no use paying attention to all of the let's say, subsections that you are performing poorly in if some of those subsections only account for 1 or 2% of the SAT, whereas other ones account for as much as 10% of the SAT. So as part of our assessment process, we also provide guidance and advice in terms of university options and SAT and GPA planning. And then those gaps that we identify in the exams, we fill them in systematically through premium one-on-one tuition with our trained in-house team of tutors. This can be done online or in person. And so basically, Genius has been supplementing, as I mentioned earlier, the school system and preparing students for the SATs and entrance into international universities for 28 years now. The thing to understand is that we aren't just a tutoring agency. Our team of tutors are in-house instructors who've been through a very rigorous vetting and training program. We work very closely with them and the school and your family over the duration of the course to ensure a great result. Here are some of the things that parents have said about our program. So the assessment process is convenient and pain-free. The lessons happen at a time that suits you, even if that means evenings, mornings, weekends. You will improve your SAT score, and the lessons are one-on-one and can happen at the home or online. Because you improve your SAT score, you will therefore have access to a bigger pool of universities to choose from. And once your kid gets there, because they've done all of the preparation, and it's not just learning for the test, it's about learning the content. There's a reason why universities use these tests as barriers to entry. So once they get there, they're going to be well positioned to excel academically. So if we flip over to the next slide, you can book an assessment with us or just reach out to chat and ask questions by contacting us either through our website, on this email address provided, on our landline, or on my cell number. This is my personal cell phone number. At the end of this webinar, you are also going to get an email with all of our details. So you will have access to that. We are going to take a 20-second recess to just have a look at some of the FAQ questions, and then we're going to jump into FAQ. If anyone has any questions, now's a good time to use the FAQ function to type them in, and we'll select and go like that. If you don't want to ask a question in this webinar, you're more than welcome to send an email with a question. We'd be very happy to answer. Let's go over to FAQ. Okay, so I have one question here about the basically the GPA and what the difference between a weighted and a not weighted GPA is. So when a GPA is calculated, and in fact, Yuri, if maybe you could go back to the previous slide where that GPA table was. When a GPA is calculated, a poor way to do it is to add up all of your marks and work out the average and get an end result and then translate that to a GPA. A far more accurate way to do it, where weighted GPA is appropriate, is you go in grade 9, you list all of your subjects. By each subject, you write, this is the mark that I got for that subject at the end of the year. So grade 9 maths, I got hopefully 83%. Grade 10 maths, I got 81%. Grade 11 maths, I got 92%, whatever it is. And then for each of those individual scores, you translate them individually into the GPA. Now, you will have more subjects in grade 9 because typically IEB students are taking way more subjects in grade 9 than they are in grade 10, 11, and 12. So you don't work out your GPA for grade 9 and then 10 and 11 and 12. No, you work it out for each of the subjects. You end up, let's say, with 15 quality points or GPA scores, sub-scores in grade 9, let's say 7 or 8 in grade 10, 11, and 12, you add those all together and divide by the total. And that's how you would get a weighted GPA. What table do you use? Whether it's the left, right, or middle one here or something else, it won't be different entirely, but slightly different. You will have to look online, and it will depend very much on the institution. I hope that answers the question. Brad, anything to add there?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, excellent. So the next question here is, do you need to write the SATs if you'd like to apply to schools in Canada? So unfortunately, this question can't, the answer is, for some schools in Canada, yes, absolutely. Just like in the United States, many schools in Canada either require or accept, and it will be to your advantage to write an SAT. And many schools in Canada, just like some schools in the United States, don't require or use an SAT at all. If you submit it, it's not going to be considered at all as part of your application. So Canada and all over the world, it very much depends on the specific university. Brad?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It depends on the university, and any university that you're actually interested in will have that information listed on their website. So if you go and look for their application requirements, it'll tell you whether you need to write the SAT or not.
Okay, brilliant, cool. So do we help with SAT test registration along with tuition? Yes. So look, this is something that we do for free as part of our assessment process, simply because it's about 2 hours of administration and it's not hard to do. It's just a matter of going on to it's the College Board website. You know, there are a whole lot of survey questions that they ask that you don't really need to fill in. It has no bearing. But if you do fill them in, you're going to be there for hours. And if you don't, it can be a 40-minute process, let's say. So yes, we do assist with that. Absolutely, we can do it. We can have one of our tutors who is qualified in assisting with SAT registration come out to the home, or we can do it as part of the initial assessment process. Right, so you mentioned an SAT recommended reading list. Where can we access this? So this is as simple as typing in on Google, SAT recommended reading list. We actually are in the process of putting together an in-house one, and we'll put that on our website. That's not going to be up in the next week, but there are literally, I can say without fear of contradiction, there are literally hundreds of SAT suggested reading lists. You know, if you go to Prep Scholar, for example, which is one of the online advice sites that we recommended, there are some great lists there as well. Right, are the SATs essential during COVID? This is a great question. The answer is it very much depends on the institution. And so our advice to parents is you don't want to risk it. There was a period where many institutions were not requiring the SAT, or it would be unfair to have asked candidates to hand an SAT and get compared to candidates who didn't have SAT write opportunities in their area. However, there always have been institutions who require the SAT. There always will. And if you're going for your sort of tier 1, tier 2, highly competitive universities, you definitely want to take the SAT.
Yeah, just something to add there is, even though you'll probably read a lot about universities not requiring it anymore, or the sort of move towards it being non-essential, you have to remember that the system of our system of education is not something that a lot of those admissions officers are familiar with. So if you do, as Dean said, want to make yourself as competitive as possible, it is the only helpful way to show them that your academic standards are higher than anyone else's.
Brilliant. Okay, next question is there a limit to how many practice tests you can write under exam conditions at Genius before your official test? Probably, yeah. We haven't had a student hit the limit yet. I think on file we have something like 25, maybe 30, something in that realm of SATs. Not only that we have the answers and the scoring scales for, but that we have the diagnostic tool set for. So that means that once you've written the SAT, we can break it down and see really in what subsections of the 37 that we discussed you've performed well and not well. Many students don't go that far. It depends on the course. Some of our students who need to drastically improve and do a very intense course will write as much as once or twice a week under exam conditions at our assessment center in Fourways. Some students will write twice in a course of 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. So it's very dependent on the student's schedule, but also what their needs are. Right, someone has asked about the difference between the ACT and the SAT. I'm going to explain very briefly. I don't have a lot of information about that in front of me right now, and there is a lot of good quality information on that online. Typically, for IEB students, we recommend the SAT for 2 main reasons. The one is there is not science included. In the ACT, there's science or scientific thinking. You don't necessarily have to have taken physical science and biology in school to score well in it, but the thinking really helps and gives you a competitive advantage. And students all over the world who are taking science, who write the SAT on that basis, have that competitive advantage. The second is that there just are so many more resources available online for the SAT, so many more practice tests, so many more practice videos, so many more textbooks. So there's such a wealth of high quality information that taking the SAT in most cases is a no-brainer. Here are some reasons why you might take an ACT instead of an SAT, and why we've had students take ACTs instead of SATs. And just to mention that we do provide ACT testing with similar diagnostics and tuition with tutors who are trained in the ACTs. So why we might recommend an ACT, the timing is different. The ACT months aren't the same as the SAT months. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're different, which means, for example, if you want to write a test to get accepted into a university or into some kind of scholarship system in April, you have to write in April, you're going to have to take the ACT, you can't write the SAT. If you are particularly good at science and scientific reasoning and scientific thinking, you just have an aptitude for it, you might have a competitive advantage in the ACT. And there are also differences in the timing. Again, all of this information is available online, and I think that's a fair enough summary. Right, I'm going to answer this question. Sorry, not how. Do I get notified about my child's progress if I enroll in the program? How engaged would I be with their tutor? Okay. So the first thing to understand is, like I mentioned in the talk, we are not a tutoring agency. We don't outsource to tutors. The tutors are on-staff employees. They have come through an extremely rigorous training and vetting program. And once they're in, we know them all personally. We work with them very closely. I mean, I know them all personally. We meet them weekly. We do supervision of the lessons. We have regular tutor management and program management meetings with them. And then after every lesson, we send out a report which is written on that lesson. How did the lesson go in terms of attitude and preparedness? What was covered in the lesson? What homework was and wasn't done? What homework is set for the next lesson? That all gets sent to the parents and sometimes the teachers at school as well. And then every so often, and we like to do it either once a month or as frequently as we're doing tests, we do a full feedback session on the diagnostics, on the tests, and on the progress of the course with you at your home. So I hope that answers your question. And how engaged would you be with the tutor? Yeah, I mean, you have absolute unfettered access to the tutor, but basically the real value in our program comes from the course manager, the education manager, who's guiding and leading the process to make sure that we get a great result. Right, a question here. Can training happen in groups? Can it happen at Rodin in the afternoon? So what we really specialize in, what we're very good at, and what we've done for the last really 20 plus years, 28 years, is one-on-one tuition. There's something magical about evaluating exactly where a student is and where their weaknesses and strengths are, and then very effectively and very efficiently cutting through those weaknesses to get them to the higher level skills that you need to teach them. So although a group session like this, where we can talk about an overview and a meta perspective on the SAT is useful. If I'm teaching a student one-on-one for the SAT mathematics, for me to firstly build a relationship with that student, and then secondly know exactly where their strengths and weaknesses are, what they don't know and do know, that's just, I mean, that's the most effective way to do tuition, private tuition as far as we're concerned. So group tuition isn't something that we offer at the moment, yeah, I mean, you're more than welcome to email out and ask more questions around that. Okay, so what services regarding SAT prep are provided at your center in Fourways? The center in Fourways is really just two things. It's the assessment center and the training center. So we use it as a training center for tutors and meetings with tutors, that kind of thing. And it's an assessment center where parents and the student will come for the initial meeting. Students will write tests. We have an exam center built in, and the feedback session will happen at home. The lessons will happen at home. So the only things really that happen at our center are the initial assessment and the tests. Cool. Brad, when I see you nod, I'm not going to ask if there's anything to add. Cool. All right, so last question here. Does Genius help students with getting scholarships into universities in the USA? Right, so no, we don't. This is not our area of expertise at all. When there are specific scholarship opportunities, we refer out to specific institutions, and I'm going to have Brad speak about that a little bit more. But really what we're good at, what Genius Premium Tuition does, is we evaluate student strengths and weaknesses in the SAT, and then we just target those gaps and get them a great SAT score. In addition to that, you know, we can help with the IEB work and GPA planning, like I discussed. But the scholarships, we refer out to experts. And maybe on that note, over to Brad.
Yeah, so there are obviously a lot of ways to get funding to go across and study in the States. And that's obviously a huge obstacle for many parents here. It's very expensive to study at universities in the States, but there are lots of ways to get funding for it. The company I work for, Aspire Atlantic, we do sports scholarships for US universities. So if you are a high achieving sports person and you want to go and study in the States, we assist you with finding a sports scholarship. So obviously a lot of that funding is given by the university itself, and it's over a range of areas. So there'll often be funding available for people of certain descent, of people from certain areas of the world, people even from certain areas of America, people who have American ancestry. If you want to study a specific subject, there's a lot of funding available at these universities. So it is a matter of researching that and finding out what the specific university that you're interested in offers, and then finding out how you can access that more easily. Any scholarship is both, it's always going to rely on the academic side. So that is why the SAT is actually so important, because no matter what you're also good at and whatever else you're pulling in, it does rely quite heavily on your academic side. So you need to prove to whoever it is, coaches, or if it's a cultural scholarship to the cultural staff, that you'll be able to pass your classes, that you'll be able to achieve at a high enough level to graduate with a degree, which is the most important thing for all of those universities over there in the States.
Thanks, Brad. Cool. So there are a couple more questions. We're not going to get time to get to them all. I'm going to answer the last question now, which is how does the tutor training work? What do we mean tutor training? So when a tutor applies at Genius, they come through initially many tests, psychometrics, school level subject tests, if they're going to be tutoring the SATs, initial SAT, skills-based tests. And if they pass all of that, they must have excelled academically in school to even get access to the tests. But if they pass all of that, they come in for an interview, and if they get accepted, and very few of them do get accepted, they go on to what can be a 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6-week training program, in which our teaching and pedagogy is taught to them, and the content in a lot more detail is taught to them. SAT tutors, while in that program, which involves observation lessons, supervision lessons, role play lessons, there's practical manuals they have to study and write application tests on. If a tutor wants to become an SAT tutor, then under exam conditions, they have to perform at the 99th percentile at our assessment center for the SAT. And after they do that, they have to undergo our SAT training course, because not just good enough to know the content and to be able to do it, you specifically have to have a meta awareness of the skills that you used to get that score, so that you can train students on them. So there's a bit of an insight into our tutor training program. And I think based on time, we have to call it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It's been an absolute pleasure. Again, feel free to reach out telephonically or email, or on the website there's a form, and we'll chat to you soon. Thank you so much.